The air was thick with the stench of death. In a dimly lit chamber, a man lay on a bed, his body racked with fever. His eyes, wide with terror, darted from corner to corner, as if he could see the demons of his sins closing in. The priest, a stoic figure in a black robe, knelt beside him, holding a small, worn book. The man's breaths were shallow, each one a struggle against the darkness that threatened to consume him. "Confess your sins," the priest urged, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "It is the only way to find peace." But the man could only moan, his mind a chaotic whirl of guilt and fear. He had lived a life of excess, of anger and lust, and now as death loomed, he saw the consequences of his choices. The priest, understanding the gravity of the moment, began to recite the familiar words of absolution. But the man's soul was already slipping away, caught in the web of his own making. This scene, though fictional, captures the deep-seated beliefs about sin and the human soul that dominated medieval Europe. For many, the path to salvation was a treacherous one, fraught with the dangers of the 7 deadly sins: pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth. These sins were not just moral failings, they were seen as physical and spiritual diseases, capable of corrupting both body and soul. The concept of the 7 deadly sins was not new in the Middle Ages. It had roots in the works of early Christian thinkers like St. Augustine, who wrote extensively on the nature of sin and its effects on the human soul. Augustine believed that sin was a result of a disordered will, a will that had turned away from God and toward earthly desires. This idea was further developed by later theologians, including Thomas Aquinas, who wrote in his Summa Theologica that the passions or emotions were neutral but could become sinful when they were directed toward inappropriate objects or pursued to excess. In the medieval world, emotions were not just fleeting feelings. They were powerful forces that could shape a person's actions and even their physical health. Scholars like Simo Nutilla explored how medieval thinkers understood the relationship between the passions and the soul. They believed that emotions like anger and lust could not only lead to sin, but could also cause physical ailment. For example, excessive anger was thought to lead to heart disease, while lust could weaken the body and make it more susceptible to illness. The connection between sin and sickness was not just a matter of spiritual belief. It was also a medical concern. Physicians in the Middle Ages, influenced by the works of ancient Greek and Islamic scholars, believed that the body and soul were deeply interconnected. They used a system of humorous blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile to explain how imbalances in the body could lead to both physical and mental disorders. For example, a person with an excess of black bile might be prone to melancholy, which was often seen as a spiritual condition as well as a physical one. One of the most important institutions in medieval society for dealing with sin was the confessional. Confession was a sacred rite that allowed individuals to confess their sins to a priest, who would then offer absolution and penance. This process was not just about forgiving sins. It was also about healing the soul and, by extension, the body. Priests were trained to recognize the signs of sin in their parishioners and to offer guidance and support in overcoming their weaknesses. Literature played a crucial role in shaping medieval beliefs about sin and the human soul. Works like Chaucer's The Parson's Tale and the Fasciculus Morum provided moral guidance and warned readers about the dangers of the 7 deadly sins. These texts often used vivid imagery and powerful metaphors to illustrate the consequences of sin. For example, the Fasciculus Morum described how lust could lead a person to the depths of hell, while pride could elevate them to a false sense of grandeur that would ultimately lead to their downfall. The belief in the 7 deadly sins had a profound impact on daily life in medieval Europe. People were constantly reminded of the dangers of sin through sermons, religious texts, and the confessional. They were encouraged to live virtuous lives, to control their passions, and to seek forgiveness for their mistakes. This belief system created a sense of community and shared responsibility, as individuals were not only accountable for their own actions, but also for the well-being of those around them. For many, the path to redemption was a lifelong journey. It involved constant vigilance, self-reflection, and a commitment to living a moral life. The fear of sin and its consequences was a powerful motivator, driving people to seek out spiritual guidance and to strive for a deeper connection with God. In a world where the line between the physical and the spiritual was often blurred, the The concept of sin served as a reminder of the fragility of human existence and the importance of seeking a higher purpose. As the man on the bed took his final breath, the priest closed the book and stood, a somber expression on his face. He knew that the struggle against sin was far from over, for in a world where the line between good and evil was often thin, the battle for the soul was a never-ending one. Pride, or superbia, as it is often called in Latin, is a sin that has intrigued and troubled people for centuries. In the medieval world, pride was seen as one of the most dangerous sins, often considered the root of all other sins. This chapter explores what pride meant in the medieval period, how it was understood, and how it was linked to physical and mental health. In the Bible, pride is often described as a dangerous and destructive force. The first epistle of John chapter 2, verse 16 divides sin into three categories: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. The pride of life is particularly significant because it involves the rational part of the soul, the part that makes us think and reason. According to theologians, pride was the sin that caused Adam and Eve to fall from grace. They desired to be like God, which is an act of pride. Medieval thinkers like Gregory the Great emphasized the importance of pride. Gregory believed that pride was the root of all sins, and he often cited the verse from Ecclesiasticus 10:15, which says, "Pride is the beginning of all sin." This idea became a cornerstone of medieval theology and was widely accepted by scholars and preachers. Pride has many forms, or what medieval writers called species. Gregory the Great listed several, including disobedience, boasting, hypocrisy, contention, obstinacy, discord, and the presumption of novelties. Later, in the Middle Ages, pride and vainglory, excessive self-love, were often combined. For example, in the Book of Vices and Virtues, pride is described as having species like untruth, madness, presumption, ambition, vainglory, hypocrisy, and pusillanimity, lack of courage. Medieval writers often compared pride to illnesses, both general and specific. They saw pride as a disease that could corrupt the soul, much like a physical illness can corrupt the body. One homilist even said that pride is worse than other sicknesses, because it turns all remedies into poison. This metaphor emphasizes how destructive pride can be, both inwardly and outwardly. One of the most common physical illnesses associated with pride was madness or wadness. This was a state where a person's reason was turned upside down, and they wasted their time and resources on foolish things. Medieval texts also linked pride to specific diseases like epilepsy, which was sometimes called God's wrath, because it affected the head, the seat of reason. Epilepsy was used metaphorically to describe the symptoms of pride, such as a lack of self-awareness and control. Blindness was another common metaphor for pride. Pride was seen as a kind of spiritual blindness that prevented people from seeing the truth about themselves. Chaucer, in his Parson's Tale, describes pride as a swelling of the heart, where a person rejoices in the harm they have done. He also mentions how the proud often wear tight clothing that shows off their swollen body parts, giving the appearance of various medical conditions like hernias and leprosy. Swelling was a particularly powerful metaphor for pride. Both Gregory and Augustine compared pride to the swelling of tumors. In later medieval texts, pride was often linked to dropsy, a condition where the body swells due to excess fluid. One Wycliffite sermon described how pride makes people falsely presume about themselves, just as dropsy makes the body falsely appear larger. Leprosy was another disease often used to describe pride. Lepers were seen as outcasts, and their symptoms, such as swelling and blisters, were used to describe the noisy boasting of the proud. The homilist in a Macaronic sermon compared the symptoms of leprosy to the humiliations Christ suffered, suggesting that pride and leprosy were both consequences of human sin. Despite its association with the rational part of the soul, pride was not seen as purely intellectual. Medieval thinkers like Aquinas argued that pride involved the will and desire, making it an irascible appetite. This means that pride can affect both the mind and the body. For example, Walter Hilton, in his Scale of Perfection, described how even the smallest stirrings of pride in the heart could be a venial sin, a lesser sin that could be forgiven. In medieval society, pride was seen as a particular danger for people in positions of power or those who had achieved success. It was believed that the rational powers of discretion were fully developed in later adolescence and middle age, making these stages of life particularly vulnerable to pride. Preachers and writers often warned against the dangers of pride, urging people to remain humble and grateful for the gifts they had been given. Pride was also seen as a sin that could affect the community as a whole. For example, during the Black Death, some believed that pride was one of the reasons for the epidemic. They argued that the sin of pride had caused God to send the plague as a punishment. This belief underscores the deep connection between spiritual and physical health in medieval thought. In the end, pride was a complex and multifaceted sin that affected both the mind and the body. Medieval writers used a variety of metaphors and examples to describe its dangers and to warn against its consequences. By understanding pride in this way, we can see how deeply it was rooted in the medieval world, and how important it was to maintain a balance between pride and humility. In medieval times, pride was not just a feeling, but also a physical condition. People believed that pride could make you sick, and illness could make you proud. This idea was linked to the way medieval people understood the human body and its health. One of the key concepts was the idea of humors, or bodily fluids. There were 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These humors were thought to control your health and your personality. For example, if you had too much blood, you might be sanguine, which means you are cheerful and confident. If you had too much yellow bile, you might be choleric, which means you are quick to anger and ambitious. Pride was often associated with sanguine and choleric people. These were the types of people who were more likely to be proud because their bodies were warm and active. This was especially true for young and middle-aged men, who were at the peak of their physical and mental abilities. In medieval texts, there are warnings about the dangers of pride at this stage of life. For instance, a Middle English poem called Of the Seven Ages warns mature men to be cautious of pride. However, pride wasn't just a problem for men. Women were also criticized for being proud, especially when it came to their appearance. Wearing fancy clothes and jewelry was seen as a sign of pride, and this was often mentioned in sermons and moral teachings. One of the most significant connections between pride and illness was the plague, which swept through Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. The plague, also known as the Black Death, killed millions of people. Medieval people tried to understand why such a terrible disease was happening, and they often turned to religious explanations. Many believed that the plague was a punishment from God for the sins of the people. Among these sins, pride was often the most important. People thought that God was angry because of the pride in society, such as the extravagant clothing, tournaments, and the general sense of self-importance. Some texts even blamed the high death rate among children on the pride and disobedience of the young and their parents. Religious leaders and writers often called for special prayers and processions to ask God to stop the plague. They believed that if people repented and changed their ways, God might have mercy and end the suffering. For example, Archbishop William Zouch of York ordered special processions to be held twice a week to pray for God's mercy and to stop the plague. Medieval doctors also tried to understand the plague from a medical perspective. They believed that the plague was caused by corrupt air, which entered the body and caused an imbalance in the humors. Some doctors thought that certain behaviors, like excessive sexual activity or anger, made people more susceptible to the plague. They recommended specific remedies, such as herbal medicines and changes in diet, to protect people from the disease. Astrology also played a role in understanding the plague. Many believed that the positions of the planets at birth influenced a person's health. In 1345, a particular alignment of Saturn and Mars was blamed for the plague. This alignment was thought to create a harmful quality in the air that could make people sick. However, not everyone who was exposed to the corrupt air got sick. Doctors believed that people with certain humoral compositions were more likely to fall ill. For example, sanguine and choleric people, who were warm and active, were more vulnerable. In literature, the plague was sometimes used to illustrate the consequences of sin. For example, in the poem Piers Plowman, the priest reason explains that the plague was a punishment for pride and other sins. The wind from the south, which was believed to carry the corrupt air, was seen as God's instrument to punish the people. In the end, medieval people saw the plague as a complex issue with both natural and supernatural causes. They believed that God had the ultimate power to cause and cure the disease, but they also recognized the role of human behavior and the environment. This understanding combined religious faith with medical knowledge, reflecting the complex way medieval people viewed the world around them. In medieval times, the church and its teachings played a huge role in people's lives, guiding them on how to live right and avoid sin. One of the most important sins they warned against was pride. Pastoral writers, or religious teachers, often linked pride with health, suggesting that being too proud could harm your body as well as your soul. For example, they believed that if a person was very healthy and beautiful, they might become too proud. On the other hand, if someone was sick or had a physical deformity, it could make them more humble. This idea was based on the belief that humility, or being humble, was a virtue that could protect against pride. Humility meant recognizing how weak and fragile the human body is, and that we are all susceptible to disease and death. One text, the Summa Virtutum de Remediis Anime, describes humility in a very physical way. It talks about how our bodies are full of things that are naturally disgusting, like phlegm in our stomachs and waste in our bowels. This was meant to remind people that no matter how great they might feel, their bodies were still flawed and vulnerable. But the church also taught that being humble wasn't just good for the soul. It could also bring material benefits. For instance, paying tithes, which is giving a portion of your income to the church, was seen as a form of humility. It was believed that this act of humility could lead to physical health and good harvests. Another text, Quatuor Sermons, described meekness, or being gentle and patient, as the ultimate remedy against pride and a kind of healing salve. However, the church also warned that taking humility too far could be a form of pride. In the Summa Virtutum de Remediis Anime, it is said that excessive fasting or denying yourself necessary food and sleep could be harmful. This was seen as a form of pride because it showed a disregard for the body's needs, which God intended to be met. The text argues that such behavior robs nature of its necessary substance and withholds payment of the owed service to God. One of the most interesting discussions of this idea comes from a text called The Cloud of Unknowing. The author talks about young monks who, in their zeal to be spiritual, misunderstood a metaphorical instruction to lift up their hearts to God. Instead of understanding this as a spiritual act, they took it literally and stared up at the stars, thinking they could pierce the heavens with their gaze. This misunderstanding led to physical and mental exhaustion, as they strained their bodies and minds in a way that was not intended. The author explains that this kind of pride can lead to a loss of rational thinking and even make a person act like an animal. The Cloud of Unknowing also warns against mistaking physical sensations for spiritual experiences. The author describes how some monks might feel a warmth in their chests and mistake it for the fire of love from God. But this warmth could actually be a physical reaction caused by their own pride and presumption. This mistake can lead to hypocrisy, heresy, and error, as they misinterpret their physical experiences as spiritual ones. The importance of understanding the difference between the spiritual and the physical was a key theme in medieval teachings. The Cloud of Unknowing emphasizes the need for self-awareness and control over the body to avoid falling into the trap of pride. The text suggests that true humility involves recognizing the limits of the body and avoiding the extremes of either excessive indulgence or excessive abstinence. In a world where death and disease were common, these teachings served as a reminder that health and beauty could be both a blessing and a curse. They encourage people to be humble, not just for spiritual reasons, but also to maintain their physical well-being. The balance between pride and humility, between the spiritual and the physical, was a constant struggle that medieval people had to navigate, guided by the wisdom of their religious texts and teachings. Envy is a tricky sin. Unlike greed, which might make you feel good about getting something, or anger, which might give you a rush of energy, envy only brings pain. Chaucer, the famous medieval writer, once wrote that envy is the only sin that has no pleasure in it. It's all about feeling sad when others are happy and happy when others are sad. This twisted emotion makes you feel bad, and it's not natural or healthy. In medieval times, people thought about envy in terms of the body. They believed that envy could make you sick, both inside and out. For example, a book called the Fasciculus Morum said that feeling joy and sorrow for others is normal. But envy is the opposite. It's like being inhuman. Envy can even harm you more than anyone else, because it's like poisoning yourself with your own feelings. Medieval thinkers like Aquinas, a famous theologian, believed that envy was a kind of twisted sorrow. He thought that even demons, who don't have physical bodies, could feel envy because it's a deep, emotional pain. But for humans, envy is tied to the body through our feelings and the balance of our humors, which were thought to control our health and behavior. Envy has many faces. It can show up as hatred, grumbling, or even lying. Some writers, like Walter Hilton, even linked it to melancholy, a kind of deep sadness. Envy was often described as a disease, and the body of the envious person was seen as diseased. In old stories and poems, envy was often personified as a sick, pale figure with a venomous breath, living in a dark, cold place. This image comes from the Roman poet Ovid, whose work was well known in medieval times. The Bible also talks about envy in physical terms. It warns that envy can shorten your life and even rot your bones. The Bible often describes envious people as having evil eyes, which means they look at others with malice. This idea of the evil eye was common in many cultures, and it suggests that envy can cause physical harm. Medieval writers often linked envy to specific illnesses. For example, the Ancren Wis, a guide for religious women, says that envy is like poisoning yourself. Another writer, John Gower, described envy as a disease that makes you sick because of someone else's good fortune. Envy was often compared to venom, and the heart was seen as the seat of this venom. The heart of an envious person was thought to be poisoned and twisted, making it hard for them to see the good in others. One of the most common illnesses associated with envy was jaundice. Jaundice makes your skin and eyes turn yellow, and it was seen as a sign of an envious heart. The Fasciculus Morum compared envy to jaundice, which is caused by a problem in the liver. Just as jaundice makes you feel weak and sick, envy makes you feel weak and bitter. Envy was also sometimes linked to palsy, a condition that causes tremors and weakness. In this case, palsy symbolized the envious person's inability to show love and kindness to others. They were so focused on their own feelings of jealousy that they couldn't move forward in a healthy way. In the end, envy is a sin that harms the envious person more than anyone else. It's like a disease that eats away at your soul and your body. Medieval writers and thinkers wanted people to understand that envy is not just a feeling, it's a choice that can have serious consequences. By recognizing the physical and emotional toll of envy, they hope to encourage people to choose love, kindness, and gratitude instead.